well fed and ready to go for our second session. I said keep it nice and short and sweet for now. So I said our second session is being led by Meghan Parry. She's head of literature at ETAQ. And basically I'm really excited about this session and really excited because I get to work with Meghan in session 3 this afternoon. But if I could have your help welcoming her, that would be a really great start to the session.
Thanks everyone and good morning. So to start off with, I know that we've had some really good engagement with the syllabus and we're looking at all of these different ideas. Today what I'm going to give you is sort of an overview of my thinking because we are a little bit further into the process because we have started our Year 10s looking at literature this year. We're playing around with it because these poor Year 10s, this poor cohort who seems to be the test generation for everything, coming in with prep and coming into this new system. So we thought we might give them a little bit of a break instead of smashing them with something new again in Year 11 and 12. So I'm going to step you through my thinking process as well as the school's thinking process and taking it down from just being a syllabus and what's on the content in the syllabus into how you turn that into something in your school. So into sort of a more fine-grained approach, fine-grained detail, not quite as in here's a whole unit ready to go for you because like I said, we're already developing, well not unfortunately developing, but unfortunately don't have that for you. We're already developing the Year 10 one, so we're doing that as we go. We'll go into 11 and into 12, but it's already set up and thought about and that's part of the thinking process. So, you know, the joke, speaking of identity. I've been at BGGS since last year. My position is the head of subject literature, so I sit under various other people in terms of responsibility, but literature itself is my responsibility. It's just the way that the school structure works. I am responsible in part for the literature syllabus. I was on the expert writing team, so, you know, don't blame me, but maybe a little bit. And I was also at a couple of the QCAA rollouts for the literature syllabus. So I do have a reasonable amount of knowledge, I would hope I can say, about the actual syllabus itself and where the thinking sits behind that and then where you can apply that thinking to your own school. So hopefully today I'm just going to step you through and show you what that's been like for me with someone who's sat very close to the syllabus so that you can start doing the same sort of process. So a couple of things, not to scale, okay, different bits and pieces, but this is what we're going to go through. Really pragmatic considerations that you have to think about. So for example, the book list with the EA sitting at the top and the choices that you need to make and how you can make those and how you can make them purposefully, hopefully. We'll look at timings as well because that's going to come into play differently for all of you based on your school context. So I'll talk about what my school context is and what that will look like. We'll discuss a little bit whether or not this is a brand new subject and where we can find places to connect it to our own understanding and the ways that we've been teaching for however long that you've been teaching. And then also looking at using and not abusing the syllabus. Okay, you don't need to yell at it too much. You might want to, but using it to help you because it is there to help you with that new high definition syllabus. And then we'll look at 2 different ideas for Unit 3. So one more analytical focused, one more creative focused, and I'll talk to you about the reasons why we've made the choice to do that as well. So into the list. It is prescribed, not proscribed. An important thing to remember as English teachers that we are looking, and particularly literature teachers now as well, that we are looking at the language itself. So take your medicine, not your poison. You can use the list. You can use the list very carefully and very purposefully. It doesn't have to be a barrier. It can also actually work for you if you are looking for connections. So Claire spoke a little bit about that idea and we've saw some ideas about how they all connect together. And that's a really important thing. It's something that I've done looking at the list and working backwards through there to meet with the syllabus. Then in terms of timing and the way that the book list works. So this is a school-based decision that we'll be starting Year 12 in Term 4 of Year 11. That's just happening, okay, beyond my control. Powers that be have decided. And so a note on text selections then is that in terms of Year 11 and then up into Year 12, we're looking at some shortened time frames. We're looking at perhaps not trying to do the most difficult thing possible, that we go for the simple but effective model. We talk to our students about it, we talked about being simple but effective, so do it in your own life as well. You know, lead by example, all those sorts of things. The big thing about the text selection is that you are working backwards. We all know where we're ending up. It's that EA. I would suggest to you, and it's the thinking that I've gone through, we picked our EA first. We knew what we were going to do first, and everything else then is working towards that. It is also working towards, building those skills, developing those skills so that our students feel really comfortable to be able to go and do that one. Rather than just sort of picking a couple and hoping and moving them around, and then the EA suddenly pops up at the end. We don't want to do that. We want to make sure everything is purposeful, everything is running through. So, maybe that's decided to die. Built-in tech support. The other thing is that you need to pay attention to the rules. There are rules in the literature text list, and that again make them work for you, not against you. So mentioned this morning that you have 6, but only 3 of them have to be in depth. So the suggestion then is that you use supporting texts, that you are building, that you are supporting other texts, that you're building an idea, and then you're looking for where those text connections come into. That is those big ones off the list, that you actually think about it like that they have partners, that they have pairs as much as they can, and then they might have other ones sort of sitting around underneath them. So we will have a go in a minute at trying to find some of those connections and hopefully sharing them amongst you as well. That, you might see something differently to other people, or other people might know a text that you don't know and see that there's a link through there somewhere. So finding a big idea, a big concept, and making that all work for you. This is the thinking then that I've done. Okay, we have to have this has to work out, you have to have all of these as well. So in terms of running through, that's our 4 definite must-have texts. And then the other ones we can move around. As you can see over there for the IA3, there is no prescribed text list for that one. I've made the choice that my students will have a text that they will use, just to sort of give them a basis that they can run from, instead of saying, just run free in the wilderness, children, and hope that something appears at the end. That they do actually have something that they can choose to play off if they would like. And again, that's a me decision, not necessarily a syllabus decision, but it works in the rules of the syllabus. It isn't one of those 4 because it doesn't fit in, all right, because there is no prescribed text list. I haven't put one of my 4 into that. I've made sure that it is just one of those extra texts that I'm going to use out of the 6. And then we will do 3 in depth and in detail. You can imagine, because we have 3 units that have texts that are attached to them, there will be at least 1 text in every single unit. That is the one that you go into depth with. So in terms of, those are big ideas, and I'll come to this point at the end. It is a brave new world of sharing is caring as well. We need to think about, we now are all Queensland teachers in it together against the QCAA. There is nothing better. There is nothing better than a bit of groupthink, right? Calling it brave new world, those sorts of things. Nothing better than actually coming together and putting your heads together in days like this, but also in less professional sort of settings, that you are doing it with your colleagues, that you're talking to other people, talking to connections that you have in different schools. Don't silo it off, don't hide it. So in terms of connecting and doing these sorts of things, these are my ideas at the moment. They're probably pretty much going to stay there because we are working like that. So we are going to run Leah in the external for a variety of reasons. And then from the other ones, those are the ones that we're looking at off the prescribed text lists. That's just what works for us. We make sure then, if I just go back for a second, that we have all of those. They fit in, they're simple, they're effective, they work for us, they work for our context, they work with the syllabus. Yours might be completely different, and that's great. I might steal a few of your ideas and put them in different places, use them as supplementary text, use them as supporting ideas, but that's up to you. So you can think about maybe this is somewhere that you start on that sort of journey of where you're going and your understanding of them. And as you see down the bottom, plus other texts. you really need to think about what else you can use. As Claire was talking about, this isn't a subject for for students, in that moment. For students who don't want to read, this is a subject for students who want to read, who want to enjoy reading and creating and analysing. So give them stuff to read. Give them a bit of cultural capital. Give them different things. It doesn't have to be 6 books in one term. You might give them a novel, a part of a novel. Show them 20 minutes of a movie. Show them an episode of a mini-series. Show them a couple of poems. All sorts of things. Bring them together as you need. It is common sense. It is extract work in Units 1 and 2. I'm not sure how much you've engaged with looking at Units 1 and 2 because a lot of us are doing that backward mapping. But Unit 2 is intertextuality. So you have to look at different texts. You need to look at the ones that combine and create and go across different things. And then Unit 1 is an introduction to literature. So it would be heavily suggested that you give them more than one type of literature to look at. If you're introducing them to literature and you say literature is just novels and then you have to teach them poetry and films, etc., in the rest of their time with you, that's probably not going to sit very well with them. So use that opportunity and then use that opportunity to start sort of breeding these ideas into them as they go. For example, my thinking with this and my thinking with this unit that I'm going to talk to you about is that we're picking a text, picking a novel, looking at Heart of Darkness. Okay, if we're looking at Heart of Darkness, we're looking at identity, there are plenty of things that are very, very similar and plenty of things just off the text list that you can pull out, you can combine, you can attach. Like I said, it doesn't have to be all of these, it doesn't have to be any of these. There are plenty of other things that you can use. So what I did with this is I looked at, there's a couple other considerations in terms of working backwards, but then once we'd sort of settled on Heart of Darkness and settled on the idea of the identity of otherness and alterity and all those sorts of ideas, what could I find in the text list, and just in the text list, that I can combine together? And that's really that thinking that you need to do. These are, I know that they don't seem like that they're, when you first see them, that the new syllabus and the text list and everything else that's coming out, it doesn't seem very much like it's all helpful tools, but they are. You can use them if you think about where you can put them in, if you think about how you can make everything work for you. And in saying that, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a thought and a little bit of a break. I am going to make you share. My apologies. But it's okay because I'm going to let you talk to other people first so it's not just your ideas. I do have a couple of copies of the prescribed text list. And what I want you to do is have a look at which ones could you combine. So it doesn't have to be necessarily for Unit 3, but we heard some good ideas in Session 1, some really great ideas about where things might fit. If you've had a conversation over morning tea, have a think about how now you can use the text list to your advantage. Where are the connections? Are there other connections then that you could be making to post-colonial or representation of otherness or alterity besides these ones that you can do there? So if you don't have a copy of the prescribed text list, I do have a couple of copies here that we can hand out. And what you need to do first is have a look at anything that you think fits as a companion text to another one. You know which texts fit together. As English teachers, if we said, what's this, what's this, what's this, you can start to tell us. So now's your opportunity to tell each other, and that vein of sharing is caring. Don't keep it to yourself. Yeah. Okay, everyone, I might get you to come back in a minute. Okay, so hopefully you're sharing some ideas there, but as I understand that, I go to conferences too, I go to PDs and I sit with people that I know and I sit with people that are in similar schools or same schools as me. So I'm going to do something with you now that, does mean a little bit of further sharing, as that practice of sharing is caring, okay, adding that in. It's a strategy that I use in the classroom. It's give one, get one. So all you need to do is find someone in front of you, behind you, around you. You don't have to stand up. It's okay. I understand how annoying that is. You can just swivel yourself somewhere. Find someone else that's sort of not super familiar to you, and just give them an idea that you talked about very quickly. There doesn't have to be a lot of structure to it. We were thinking about this, and then get one from them that you might want to write down. Okay? So do that very quickly. Have a quick chat. Okay, everyone, I might get you to come back in. I hate to interrupt, but we need to keep going. So, a couple of things that I heard sort of moving around. We've got some of those ideas again about magic realism. There's plenty of things on that text list that you can use all throughout in lots of different forms. I heard some ideas about the Bildungsroman and what you could be doing with that and looking at that in different contexts as well as different genders. There's been, there is a bulk of interesting articles out there about whether or not the female Bildungsroman actually exists. That could be something very interesting that you look at, perhaps. I heard some ideas about revenge and those sorts of things. So I hope that you can see that there are connections and that this is a resource that you can use, not to look at it and just go, oh my God, what am I possibly going to be able to do? But here are various different things that you can perhaps put together. Here's a new way of thinking about how you might be able to actually use this now that you have put your ideas together, now that you've looked at the syllabus a little bit more, now that you know maybe generally where you might head, what your school context would be, how that would work within your school context. So I'm going to do this very quickly. Hopefully we can just jump through. Would anybody like to share what their overall concept is, or what some ideas are, where they might go with them? Do you want to explain your revenge one?
I've spoken to a couple of people about this. My idea was based on the idea of revenge. And I liked the idea of the kids maybe doing a monologue for like how to get away with murder. So you would look at texts that would involve Heaps, King Lear, maybe Heart of Darkness in terms of the darker side of humanity, Picture of Dorian Gray, The Black Medea, and True Grit. Would be some that I would look at.
And I suggested Gone Girl as well.
Yeah,
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And there are lots of different ways in, and also making sure that you're thinking about what your assessment is and where your assessment is going to go from there. Okay. Are you looking at the creative part? Are you looking at the analytical part? What are you going to do with this? Because it's not just sort of, here's a text, let's make it up as we go along. There are all of these other things that sit underneath it that you do need to think about. You need to think about where you're going with it. So we'll start to move sort of more into that finer grain then of what you might be doing. So this idea, how new is literature? Not that new at all. All of these things you probably recognise, you've probably done at some point, you know what you're doing with it. And literature itself, the idea is that this is equal to English. It is not, under any circumstances, the Maths B of English. It is still English. The idea is that they are parents. One would hope then that the metaphor suggests to you that they are equal in the relationship. But literature itself is more focused. We focus just on analytical, just on creative. Different versions of creative, but just those two. And like you heard in the first session, it isn't necessarily for those high flyers. I can tell you from my own experience, so we've got Year 10 girls doing it at BGGS, and some of them are girls that I had in English last year, and they are not the top flyers in English at all. But they really enjoy reading, they enjoy writing, they enjoy reading about writing, and they have done exceptionally well in that class as so far. So it is finding the way in, it is finding the subject that works for them, and that's the sort of thing that you need to be presenting. The other thing that I want to tell you about literature is that this is probably the subject that a lot of people in the room have thought, this is the subject I wanted to do at school. So please make it that subject, okay? Make it the subject that you wanted to do. Think about your own students, obviously, but make it the subject that you want to do. Don't make it so big and ridiculous and laborious that it's not something that you would want to do at school. Think about how you can use and feed off the enthusiasm. It is, it can be or will be in some schools that idea of an elective, not something that we've had really in English before. So you need to think about it like an elective a little bit, that there's a little bit of selling that goes on, but that you're making sure that you're using the syllabus you're running through. It is the subject that you would have wanted to do. In terms then of assessment and coming down, so we're sort of going, quite large and then coming down over this presentation. When you're looking at your assessment, when you're looking at what this is, there are huge similarities to 2010 English syllabus. You can see them, you can run them through, all those sorts of ideas. The only real addition is that this dot point here is directly from the syllabus, so student responses are evidence-based and draw on a range of interpretations of literary texts. So as we heard in session 1, a range of interpretations. That means that your students need to be looking at how other people interpret them. As students of literature, as teachers of English, you look at the way that people interpret. Now it's giving it over to the kids as well. You teach them a couple of ways to interpret and show them other ways people have interpreted. That's not necessarily a huge new thing. It's more that you are just now purposely giving it to them and that the students actually have to do something with it. And if they're uncomfortable with it, you can talk to them about the fact that, I'm sure they go and Google a lot of things that you give them and they find other people's interpretations and then apply them. Now you're just putting some barriers on it and hopefully preventing some of those less desirable sources coming through. In terms of what that means then, criticism, reviews, journal articles, for IA1, it's analytical, so I would suggest to you that analysis would be a good idea. What does that look like? Things like this. So I'll talk to you a little bit about what we're doing with current year 10s, but that's something that my year 10s have used that we annotated together. Things like this, we're going to talk about Arrival in Heart of Darkness, so an article from The Conversation. It's analysis, it's someone else's perspective, it's talking about the other perspectives within, an article from The New Yorker, and then, your old friend Bloom. There's plenty of analytical guides out there that you can use that sit around on the internet that you can start to build in that aren't too difficult, particularly if you're going through them with your students. And by the time that they're looking at IA1 in particular, you would have stepped them through, they would be comfortable with this process, they would know how they can apply them. It doesn't have to be a huge part of it, all right? It depends on what you're doing in your own school, but it needs to be there because it's part of the syllabus, it's part of the cognitions, it's part of what the assessment is if you want your assessment endorsed. It's got it on there. So you need to make sure that you are considering these things. Where can they come from? What can they look like? How can you build your students' knowledge, not just of the world of the text perhaps that we've done before by doing some research into the history, but how can you build their understanding of the world of the text as a piece of text that other people have looked at and interpreted, particularly with this identity unit? How are other people interpreting this? Other people in other cultural contexts? Other people in our cultural context? Other people in different time periods, in different cultural contexts? What can you do with that to enrich their learning of this as a piece of text? Okay. Using the syllabus then, because that's what I'm talking about. You have to use the syllabus. It all comes down to it. It is a high definition syllabus. That means that you have to go back to it, you have to look at it. And it isn't necessarily I am using this as a tick list for every lesson that I go through. That's definitely something that I don't want you to be looking at in terms of I'm ticking off this thing today, I'm ticking off this thing today, because you've never taught like that, so why would you start doing that now? It's English, we do all skills all the time. So thinking about how you can start to be using it though to your own advantage. Okay, so use it, don't abuse it. Also make sure it works for you. Don't let it sort of, become the work. Just a bit of background for you then. So we'll go through this first. So how do we get here? What's the thinking behind the syllabus for the identity unit? For the identity unit, the central conversations that we had were around how literature creates identity and how identity might create literature. So all, the texts are products of us as people. The texts are products of different countries, different times, different places. Are they reflecting or are they refracting? What's the purpose of them? Why would you have them? And all of that sort of sits behind that unit description. It allows us to think about, as students ourselves of literature and our own students, how can those identities change over time? How might they come back? Do they come back? Do we want them to? All those sorts of things. And also then, how are we expressing ourselves through literature? How can we find ourselves? Because you'll have a lot of students who tell you that they want to do literature because they see themselves or they find themselves in books. They see who they are, they see someone reflected. You've had that experience or you've hated a book because there's nobody in there that you can possibly understand. So that sort of plays on that idea. These are the things that sit behind it. There is a lot of thinking, I promise you, that sat behind actually writing up the syllabus and having the syllabus as a high definition document. And then this has been translated into that overall unit description, as well as the subject matter, as well as the ISMGs and everything else that goes through that. So it's just something to sort of keep in the back of your mind, and it's something that I've kept in the back of my mind as I've been going through this unit. A side note then on 21st century skills and using the syllabus, because they are in the syllabus, which means that you do have to think about them occasionally. However, he does not like me. However, all of these things that we do, if I ask you, you could tell me when you did those yesterday, okay, or last week, or the week before. Same with those. That's what an English classroom looks like, we hope. So you're doing all of these sorts of things all the time. They fit in easily. You do need to know where they are. You might want to think about how you can use some more of them. But it doesn't have to be an overwhelming, oh my God, the syllabus has so much stuff in it, how am I going to do all of it? The fortunate thing about English and literature in particular, as we're building this new subject, you're doing these things all the time. So have them in the back of your mind, but just remember that we do this all the time. Okay, in terms then of the analysis, when I decided and when I started thinking about this unit and looking at this unit, the things that I needed to think about is, what does the unit say I have to do? What are the have to? What do you have to do out of the unit description? What do you have to do out of the subject matter? Where does that fit in? What are the assessments? What are the cognitions? All right, one of those QCAA words. What are the cognitions? Find them. They're in there. They're in the subject matter. They're in the ISMGs. The subject matter leads to your ISMGs, which is what your students are being assessed on, which is what you want to practice. They're all interlinked. They're not separate things. So how am I going to have those in my class? How am I going to have those in my students' assessment? The other thing that you need to consider, obviously, is what's going to work for my students. What will work for them in our context, what will work for them in terms of getting books in, what will work for them in terms of interest, what will work for them in terms of engagement, what will work for my time frame. It's going to be a brief one, so brief ones. But also because I'm talking to you about you've got all these extra bits and pieces. Where are you going to fit that in? How are you going to do that? So all of these things need to come into considerations before you start planning that overall unit. or as you're doing it as well. It doesn't have to be, I have to sit down and do all these sort of things. Some of these are that iterative process of it goes slowly, but you get there. And then how can I forward plan towards other assessments? The big one at the end. So how can I make sure not just that my students have those skills, but they have those thinkings and they have those understandings that sit behind some of the things that I'm going to ask them to do in the EA. That it's not just sort of, surprise, go off into your test room and do that. That they have thought about it, that we talked about it the whole way through, but then also that we are within the rules of we're not doing the same assessment 4 times, or we're not doing the text preparing for the EA when you're not allowed to. All right, you can't do it in year 11 in terms 1, 2, 3 and 4, and then in year 12 in terms 1, 2, 3. Okay, so that's using those rules to help you, and how might you find ways through. So unit description, these are the things that you have to do. These are the things that we're looking at. In terms of this first one, with the syllabus in every single unit, you've got a top part, which is basically your overview, and then you've got in analytical and in creative. They very much tell you what to do. You interpret them within the boundaries, and then you apply them. So if we're looking at this bottom one here, in analytical responses, students demonstrate an understanding of how the style and structure of literary texts engage critically with representations of issues and ideas related to culture and identity in particular contexts. And then the last part about that they draw on different interpretations. So that's the bulk of it. That's what you're looking at. What are the representations of issues and ideas related to culture and identity? What cultures and identity might your students have that you can use? Or equally, which ones do you want to start to build into them? You could be thinking about the idea that, there's got to be a certain amount then, if we're, talking big L literature, that there's some cultural capital that sits in the back of these. How can we give our students that cultural capital that allows them to go out and be good humans? Which I'd suggest, I personally, that's one of my goals with my students, that they don't just go off into the wilderness knowing how to write an essay, but that they go off knowing how to perhaps, or having some experience of what a good person might be. So we think about those things. The other thing then, it sits all the way at the back, I know, but there is a glossary. And the glossary also helps you. It's a good little tool. So in terms of this unit, 2 big things from the glossary: context and cultural assumptions. You can be bringing these in and thinking about now, looking at some of those words, those keywords, which texts jump out to you in your mind from the prescribed text list. Because again, it is a high-def syllabus, you need to come back to it. You need to think about how you can use it and exploit it and change it and shape it, sorry, not change it, shape it, so that it actually helps you. So you can find ways through here as well. My way through then. Arrival and Heart of Darkness. So it could be a way through that it's colonisation, could be a way through of post-colonial, but for me it's going to be the representations of otherness, the identity of the other, the way that the other is represented in text. It opens things up a little bit. It's also something that will work in my context. And it's also something that has sort of a depth and a richness that will allow my students to be preparing themselves for where they're going. And again, hopefully to be good humans. Now I know aliens and Heart of Darkness. And also Heart of Darkness. Really? Okay. I know it's a very old book. However, there's lots of things in there that you can be pulling out. And also, it's about this big. This also came up, a fortunate discovery that I don't know if this is actually going to get off the ground, but there was a bit of news a while ago that some channel in America is going to turn Heart of Darkness into a sci-fi. So, aliens. And realistically, if we're looking at sci-fi, a lot of sci-fi is related to colonial, post-colonial literature. It's related to who is the other. You know, it can be allegories for different situations. Our students quite like sci-fi and dystopian still. It's sort of an important moment for them to be looking at those things. So why not start to build that in? Why not play off that? The other reason that I have chosen this is this, okay? So I know the suggestion or the question or the concern might be, really? Heart of Darkness at an all-girls school? Really? Is that your choice? Yes. Couple of reasons. As I mentioned before, it is very rich, it is very detailed, it has a lot of depth, it has a lot of aesthetic features. If you're going to be demanding that they are finding aesthetic features in these texts because the syllabus demands it, pick one that has a lot. Make their life easier. Simple but effective. Okay? It does the job. The other things, you know, we don't necessarily have to do these explicitly, and we might not necessarily do them explicitly. But there you can draw some strong similarities between some ideas and some themes that will appear, or that do appear, in Leah, and that do appear in Heart of Darkness. Now, I wouldn't necessarily think, now, students, we're going to look at this passage today, and when you're thinking about, at the end of this year, and we're looking at King Lear, you'll also think about, wouldn't do that, okay? We'd be focusing on this text, but you'd be talking about there are these ideas. Where do we see, or what do we understand about madness in this text? What else do we understand about power? If we're talking about other and talking about alterity, what can we find? What can we bring in that has similarities? The other thing is, it's complex language. We know that some of our students find Shakespeare to be complex language, even if we might tell them it's not that complex. But it's practice as well. If you give them sort of a whole bunch of texts and the first time that they see anything really, really complex is either just other Shakespeare or never, and then in the EA, if you choose to do that, or, and you know, it depends on if you want to do something else in the EA, please do, go for it, because there's 6 of them. If you want to do something else, think about what that text type looks like. Think about how you might build that in earlier on. How do you give your students the skills to find things in difficult language, complex language, before they have to do it for the external exam? How do you give them that confidence with yourself? How could you do that? The other thing that sits behind this is, just remember, 6 texts must be studied, only 3 must be in depth. Make your life easy. And then also, in Unit 3, it talks about an international context. Okay. An international context is a context that is not Australian. I know that, you know, seems like it should be fairly straightforward, but I just want to point that out. But on the syllabus, it does say from an international context, it just means not one from here. And you can talk about different contexts. Again, use your glossary. Think about how you can pull that in, what you can do with that. So I would suggest to you that both of those texts are from an international context, because neither of them are Australian. The other thing is, because this one, and I would suggest to you that for this unit, this is my text that I don't do necessarily in as much depth. It doesn't mean I don't do it at all. It doesn't mean that I show the film and go and move on to Heart of Darkness. It's a way in. And if you've seen the film, it is very, very rich and it is very, very detailed and it has a lot of depth. In terms of its cinematography and all of those devices, there are a lot of things that you can easily hold up and show. Remember when we saw this in Arrival? It's very similar to this written aesthetic feature. How can you draw that link across? Because that allows your students then as well to be thinking, well, if these 2 very different texts, so a very old novel and a very new film, have similar aesthetic features in them, maybe some other ones will as well. And maybe I don't need to silo my knowledge into term 1 or unit 1 and term 2, but perhaps my knowledge flows across. We would hope. And again, with literature being more focused, that you're only doing analytical and creative, that there is a clear sort of link between all of those. So think about how you might be able to build these things in, what you can do with them. The other thing that you can be thinking about with Arrival there is what other ones link into this. What can you be doing that is coming out at the moment? For those students who maybe it's not their favourite, they can find another way in. You show them that world of literature that exists as well, just, outside, beyond the dusty halls of the library, that there are other things that they can start to be bringing in, that they can start to build across. So all of this sits behind my thinking. This isn't just, I need to do a text off the text list, oh my God, what am I going to do? That one. It's, what do I need to do? What can work for me? What can work for my school? How can I start to build that into my students? And I mean, by this point as well, you've probably had them for a year, or someone else has had them for a year doing literature. So they're starting to build those ideas across and that you keep building on them. I'm also thinking that I would be then thinking backwards into Unit 2 and Unit 1. How could I have introduced ideas similar to this? How can I draw the links? And how can I point them out for my students? It doesn't need to be a secret that, we've done very similar work to this, or you've seen this aesthetic feature used by an author. Now you as an author, have a go at using it. Or you as a director, have a go at using it. If you want them to be involved, okay, and that idea that in session 1 that it does become more like a mentor role in a way. I'm experiencing that at the moment with my students who are doing it in Year 10. We're looking at intertextuality and detective fiction, and they are doing a multimodal. And that idea that they want to say, we saw this in the text that we're doing, or we saw this in that short story that you showed us, or in the episode of Miss Marple, or whatever it happened to be. Can I have a play at doing that in my multimodal? And the question is, why? Because I think it's exploiting or it's changing this. Giving them that language as well, that will help them develop into literature, and it makes your life easier, which you all want, and it makes their life easier as well. It's nothing new, just a slight change in your language, perhaps. Okay, this is where I'm thinking. However, as a proviso, we don't know what the questions are going to look like. Those questions that we saw this morning, first time I've seen them. So I'm going to take that and think about that as well. But some ideas that are coming out of the syllabus. So out of that unit description, how does language create identity? Make it really broad if you want. You would be expecting, as part of your assessment, as how you set it up, that there would be something in there about how other people see identity. Okay, you are bringing in that criticism, bringing in those different ideas. What version of the other is represented in Heart of Darkness? If you want to keep it to that, if you want to make it nice and clear where you're going, you need to do that with your assessment anyway. Okay, to get it endorsed, it needs to be clear. But starting to sort of build down, and there is, an increasing level of very, very simple and very, very vague, down into more specific and explicit maybe. And we can probably go further with those. But all of these ideas, so how does language create identity? Well, that's what the syllabus actually says, pretty much. It's what it's asking you to do. So those ideas come out directly. So when you get asked, how is this addressing the syllabus? You point at it. It's there. So you're not sort of trying to find some massive, weird, different way in that has, roundabouts and roundabouts and roundabouts. Simple but effective. Those work. Some of them are not as simple, but that's okay. Depends on what you're doing with it. But don't overcomplicate it for yourself. You've already got lots of layers that are sort of sitting on top of you for literature. Don't make it so annoying and so complicated that kids don't want to do it, or that you don't want to do it. You can come into this very, very simply and quite easily. So again, I don't know. I'm guessing. It's a fun little guessing game that we play. And a lot of these questions that are sitting there, they're questions that are very similar to questions that we do in the analytical essays at BGGS at various times. A lot of them I opened up old documents from last year, from years ago, looked at a question for an analytical and went, oh yeah, that'll work. Okay, similar ideas. It's not a whole reinvention of the wheel, it's perhaps just moving it a little bit, okay? Giving it a little bit of artificial intelligence perhaps. That you start to sort of see what you can use, see how you can change things and shape things. Okay, so now I'm going to go right down into some slightly more in-depth grain. A suggested plan, and I'm going to apologise to the TLAPs. I have used a TLAP. Okay, they're the ones off the QCA Porter website. They are important in your thinking, but it is not a necessity that you use them because I understand when you open them up, they are horrifying. There are boxes everywhere. Like, how many hours do I need to spend doing this? Okay. But you need to be thinking about how you can use that. Again, use your tools. Don't abuse them, just use them and how they work for you. Use it as you wish, change it, shape it. You might have it all the way down to doing everything that you have on what day you're going to use this skill, what day you're going to use this dot point, if that floats your boat. Doesn't necessarily float mine. Okay, but I know that I'm doing them because I know and I've looked at the ISMG, and that's the important thing as well. You know what cognitions your kids need to achieve at the end. You work backwards from there through the subject matter, back through to the unit description to check that you are doing all of those things, and then you go forward again and make sure that your students have got those skills, that they're using those skills. So in terms of that, this is what my planning would look like.
Quick question, where would we find the TLAP on the QCAA website?
There's example TLAPs. I'm not sure if there's a blank one. I do believe there might be a blank one in the literature section. So if it's in the syllabuses, there's that green box that says resources up on the top right. And there's one tab, I don't know what it's called, and the other tab is called implementation, somewhere in there.
Okay.
But essentially what it is it's sort of got, your process of weeks, etc. If you've seen the Gothic unit that has come out, that's a TLAP, sort of in its full majesty. And I know that that is quite confronting for some people, like, how are we going to do all that in that time? But, it's a suggestion. And it just depends on what you're going to do for your context. So for me, this is what my planning might look like. I've got those there purely because I can, all right? Purely because I'm showing you. Because I have sat with the syllabus for quite some time, I hope that I do know them. I'll show you a slide in a minute, which is actually a screenshot I took the other night while I was planning my current Year 10 unit of my actual working process for it because, again, I don't want them to be that year level that we sort of go, surprise, now we're doing something completely different for your assessment. Good luck. That is built in from that lower level. And if you're doing it in Year 11, that it's built in from there as well. That's just, whenever you start, you build it in. So this is how my brain works, so welcome. It's a mess. This would be how we'd come into it. So watch Arrival. It's an interesting way in, it's a good way in, it's a quick way in, it's like 2.5 hours, so a couple of lessons depending on how long your lessons are. And you might go, as you go, looking at particularly when the aliens arrive and they've got big circle smudges and they have to work out how do you decode language, because that's the aliens' identity, their language, because they speak. Okay, for a very brief, very rough overview of the film, aliens arrive and they want to speak to humans, but they can't. They do have a spoken language, but we can't understand it. And then they work out that the smudges that they're putting up on this screen sort of thing is the alien's language. So we'd look at that, and we'd look at the idea that comes through to the end. How do you build a divide? How do you build a bridge in the divide of identity between aliens and humans? So as you're going and as you're doing that, I would be starting to build in all of those different ideas because there's these ISMG subject matter cognitions that are coming through. So explore how cultural perceptions are challenged or supported in literary texts. Explore the ways in which literary texts represent culture, place and identity through language. So, I'm being very literal here, quite a literal person, because simple but effective. So take it literally. All right, we've got this film, it works. It's on the prescribed text list. It's probably there for a reason, one might guess. And then you start to examine it. Right, I don't have the detail of how you would examine it in there, because you're English teachers, look at the cinematography, look at the language that's used, look at what's going on with it. How do you start to build those sorts of things in? And then you start to examine critical responses, because there are a bunch of them about Arrival, both good and bad. Ones that say that it is very rich and it uses language and it bridges cultural divides and blah, blah, blah. And other ones that say that it's the worst film that you've ever seen in your entire life. So that's allowing your students to start building in those ideas in a very safe, easy kind of way that you're starting to build that in. They would have done it in year 11, but it's a nice way to get them back in, okay, to start off with. And then you're also starting to build in all of those other things that you need to do for the subject matter. Then, so guys, surprise, this is what we're actually going to look at. We're not looking at aliens literally, but we might be looking at the idea of alienation and otherness, and where we might see that in our lives, and where we might see that in our literature, and what's going on with that, and how can we portray it in different ways. So what can we do with it? So you start to bring in other poems. So these are poems, again, because they're short, get through some stuff. But also look at different ways that it is, because as part of your subject matter, it's explore the ways in which different literary forms may evolve due to changes in culture's identity. And I think I put it somewhere else. There's another subject matter part in there as well, that in different forms. So what does it look like in different forms? Well, in order to achieve that, you need to do it in different forms. And I don't know about you, but when you're teaching texts, generally anyway, you don't just sort of say, this is the book, we're never going to look at anything else, ever. We're not going to talk about how it might actually, come out into real life. We're not going to talk about how it might be similar to the other book that you've read. We're only going to focus on this, the conversation's only about that. You don't do that. We don't do that as real adult humans. So are we going to expect our year 12s to do that? If they're going to be real adult humans very soon? So building those sorts of things in. And then you sort of be like, hey guys, surprise, I've got this book for you. It's Heart of Darkness. I know it's old, but it's pretty similar ideas. And because you've looked at the complexity of Arrival, and this can take a week, 2 weeks, whatever you want it to take, depending on how you want to do it, doesn't matter. And you know what it's like in a school. You're like, oh, that'll take a week. And then you're missing half your class on one day, and then the other day gets cancelled because it just does. So I don't have them sort of set out like that, because it will be different in your different school contexts, and it will be different year to year. But it's these big ideas that allow me to go into the subject matter. So from there, then, once we start doing Heart of Darkness, introduce very briefly, and I mean this as in the briefest possible wisp of a breath of post-colonial theory, in terms of guys, this is what it is. Like we said this morning, literature is not a theorised subject. It doesn't mean that you completely ignore anything ever to do with it, because it's a part of the world of literature. So when you do the intertextuality unit, for example, it's probably a good idea to mention that it's a literary theory that all texts are connected. It's not just something you made up. So if you can start to build those ideas, and you just build it in a little bit, like, hey guys, just so you know, this is happening. This is in here. Just a hint of it. And then from there, you might start to build in more extensively the other ideas of what on earth that word is that starts with A and has a bunch of random letters in it. Okay, because they'll look at it, that's a made-up word, you made that up. But the idea of otherness as well, you have conversations about that, you talk about it, you analyse it in different things. If you want a way of talking about it, depends on what's happening in your school. I've started doing with my Year 10 literature class, because they are quite small, we call it family dinner. Put tables like this. I'm not always the head of the table at dinner, because I don't want to do that. I want them to have some sort of their own autonomy to be able to talk about it. and we have a conversation. We've been talking about this idea, so we've been looking at this representation of otherness. Where else have you seen it? And they'll tell you random things. They'll tell you different movies and TV shows and all sorts of things that you're looking at. Had a really great conversation with a couple of them a couple of weeks ago after we looked at the idea of Plato's cave, because we were looking at it as an allegory. And one of them went, hey, you know, I watched Truman Show on the weekend, and then explained to me how it was also an allegory of the cave. Like, thank you. You were in charge of dinner this week. Okay, so bringing like that feast of ideas. If we're getting them to use aesthetic features, sneak them into your lessons too. It's a metaphor. Okay, that idea that you can start to build all of those things in. All right, from there, back to this. So one of the big things that you really, really have to do is looking at aesthetic features. They are in the front of the syllabus. Give them to your students. There is no secret. Your students are allowed to see the syllabus. It's not hidden from them. They can Google QCAA literature syllabus, and it's the first thing that comes up in PDF. All right, if you ever need it quickly, you don't want to go through the portal, just Google, it's right there. They can see it, so give it to them. Talk to them about what those things are. What's the difference between an aesthetic feature and a stylistic device? Are they similar? Are they different? The same thing? So use them, bring them in, see how they can use all of those different things. And a part of that is, particularly for Heart of Darkness, because the language is so in-depth and so complex and so detailed, keep a list of it. When I reread it recently, I had to look up words. Do it together. Because you're also looking at language and identity in this unit. So if you don't look into that language, how are they going to achieve the syllabus? So all of these sorts of things sit behind that thinking. It's not just I picked Heart of Darkness because it talks about identity and it talks about a loss of identity, and I heard the word identity a couple of times and I was like, surprise, it fits into the syllabus. It's because I can use these things to allow my students to do the best that possible, and that they can play around with it and change things and do things differently with them. Then also, you don't just get rid of arrival. Like I said earlier, you talk to them. Now we've actually had a look at Heart of Darkness. Now we've looked at this character's representation. We've looked at what happens when you don't have language. We've looked at what happens when you do have language, but you don't understand or you don't know quite how to talk to that other group. What do you do then? How are they similar? How are they represented in similar ways? What can we do with those? It doesn't have to be huge. It's not an assignment to do that. But you build it in so that they can see that texts go across different boundaries, that there are different things that you can be looking at and doing and thinking about. So, as you're sort of starting to build those things in, you can then start to be building in more of your subject matter. Okay, all of these things are from the subject matter there. You need to make sure that you are doing all of them, and particularly the ones I've looked at with the ISMG. It is mostly that analyse cultural assumptions, attitudes, values and ideas, which should sound very familiar to you, except cultural assumptions is a word that sort of appeared, but it's one that you know. Okay, attitudes, values and ideas, or previously attitudes, values and beliefs, just for something different. That's what you need to do. You need to be able to give your students tools to be able to build those things in. So this is where some of that thinking sits behind, that you are looking at those sorts of things. You need to talk about, for this one, time period, cultural context, given that the syllabus itself talks about that so much. So look at it. Go through it with them. Ask them to think about, show you, tell you what you can do with that, because that will allow them to have that ability to analyse it through in the end. So you're finding these things. You move with your syllabus. It is very much informing you as you go. It's not just, I looked at it once and I thought about it briefly, and then I never looked at it again. How am I actually making sure that my content in my lessons, in my planning, actually fits with that to allow my students to achieve, not just on the task here now, but on other tasks as they go through. And it's the same thing for all of the units. The other thing that you can start doing through there as well is start giving them sort of a bit of analysis as you're going. What can you be doing? How are they doing it with evidence? How are they actually showing you that they're understanding? How are they helping you to, how is the text helping them to know these ideas that they are starting to have? Everything needs to be evidence-based in literature, in that it has to come from the text because you're looking at aesthetic features. How do you know that? It's not, here's a quotation or here's something about the book, here's my ideas that I generally just made up. It's where's the evidence for that? Where's the aesthetic features for that? Where are the stylistic devices? How do you know that that is coming through? Give your evidence, use your evidence with that. Okay, and then one more. Some things like this, okay, they get to play around. Just because this is the analytical unit doesn't mean that there is no creative. Give them some creative stuff because you're going to ask them to do that next term or next assessment whenever you have it. So can they play with it? Can that show them something about the text structure? If they've got all these words that one of the characters is using, or they've got all these words that describe the jungle or London or wherever it happens to be, can they apply them somewhere else? Can they apply them to another character in the text? And if yes, why does that work? If no, why does that work? Why does that not work? What's going on there with the identity of that character? How does the language actually help and sort of portray that identity? And you give them that opportunity to play around with it because you're going to ask them to play around with it in the creative pieces. So do it. The other thing that you might think about as well with Heart of Darkness is that it is a verbal retelling. So it is coming from someone's own identity. It starts off, they're on the boat, talking about it. Okay, so whose identity? What kind of identity? Are there other ways that we can think about this? Who's making the otherness? All those sorts of things. And then you start to build in as well. Look at criticisms or reviews of Heart of Darkness from the time it came out. It's what the power of the internet. You can find those things. Compare them to criticisms now. Why is the criticism different? Because in your subject matter it is asking you to do that. They need to be able to do that. They need to be able to understand that texts are different and interpreted differently based on different cultural contexts. So give it to them. Help them out. And that means then that their criticism is that much richer. And it means that when they're talking about other people's criticism, it is that much richer as well. So you can start to build some of those sorts of ideas back in. Again, you might bring it back to a rival, if you want to, at this point. You might bring it back to some of those other poems, some of those other ideas. Find places that you can use other things besides just, here's this book, read it to death, and you better like it by the end because you have to write an essay. All right, give them other things that they can do. And then this is that process then as well. Okay, unit description plus subject matter plus your specifications. So this sits further down. Keep scrolling on that document, on your syllabus document, plus your ISMG. Work backwards and forwards. I know it seems like there's a lot of things to do there, but once you start to sort of plan these out, you know, think about where you're going with it, you ideate those things. These are things that you then come back and you check off. Are you doing, they're not on there, the knowledge application criterion down there? Are you doing those things as you go? Are you making sure that your students are able to do that? Because this is an exam. The one they do at the end's an exam. But equally, they need to be able to talk to you about it in class, to practice it and think about it before they're doing any of that, which fits back into your subject matter and your unit and what you're doing with it. So you move these different ideas around, you think about how you can use them, but equally remember, a lot of this might sound very familiar to you because you're an English teacher at the moment. Hopefully you will be an English and a literature teacher sometime soon. But, you know, they are things that you know how to do, you just add on different things, and then you make sure, because this syllabus is so high def, that you use it, that it is a part of your thinking. That it isn't just sort of, it doesn't just sit on your computer, or, you know, you printed it out once last year and then left it in a nice dusty pile on your desk under everything else that, you have to do in your life as an English teacher. That you're doing all those sorts of things. And then, you add them all together. The other thing is that you have other teachers. Okay. My role at the moment is Head of Subject Literature. I'm very fortunate that I have another teacher who is teaching literature with me, but she is not the only one that I speak to about this. I have a large staff room of English teachers who I say, hey, I need something else for identity. I've got this is where I'm going, I'm thinking about this, and prepare yourself because you're going to get overwhelmed by it usually. I'm like, here's all these other ideas, and then you sort through them knowing your syllabus, those sorts of things. So use the people in your staff room. You don't have a lot of people in your staff room, use people in other staff rooms. Okay? Think about how you can use those things now that we sit in a different space. As I said before, this is my planning. As you can see, it's an excellently set out, really thoughtful, putting together of my detective fiction unit. It's very clearly, obviously planned in great formatting. But that's actually a double screen. So I put one on one side, one on the other. I check, am I doing these things as I'm going? And I'm not doing this one in this lesson necessarily. I might be doing these ones or this one in one lesson, and then another one in another lesson. Because you've never taught skills individually, so why on earth would you possibly start now? But I've got them there so that I know that I'm setting my students up well to do the assessment, that they have that they are starting to build that in. That's just the subject matter, and then like I said, I scroll up and down and I check. Because I've checked the unit description before I started doing my detective fiction unit, I know what I'm doing there because it's intertextuality. But then I look that I'm doing all of these things so that they can achieve on their ISMG and that they can achieve in their assessment at the very end. I'm going to give you this very briefly because I understand that it may not fit with your context because it is a little bit more BGGS specific in that it's about women in literature. If you want to do it in a boys' school, go for it. I'm all for it. But this is sort of something that is the next part of it. Okay? So I'm going to go from identity, culture, etc. in Heart of Darkness and Arrival, the idea of the other. And then I'm going to be looking at with my students the idea of women in literature. Crazy, I know, but there are connections through there. And then equally again, there are connections onto their next assessment pieces. This doesn't sit in isolation. This isn't just a random, I teach girls, I'll teach them about girls. There's a thought process that runs through. Okay? Representations of the other, representations of people who are different, representations of people who sit outside sometimes, particularly if we look at canonical literature, older canonical versions necessarily, that we see those. And then also, again, back here all the time, that EA, King Lear, lots of women. So building in these sorts of things the whole time, having that thinking sitting behind everything. It's not just, I teach girls, so I'm going to teach them about women, or I like those, so I'm going to teach that and hope for the best. That's important as well, that you might like your texts, or that your students will like your texts, that they'll be interested. But equally, are they going to be able to achieve with them? So I'd be looking at how is female identity shaped and formed, how it might be portrayed in different cultural contexts, how it might be portrayed differently, and that's that idea of in a different cultural context, where does that fit? A different cultural context also does fit into time periods. So both of these, Amy Whitting and Gwen Harwood, obviously older representations of women that our students might want to say are a problem. They might want to build it in. Claire stole my thunder when she was talking about Me Too. All right, that they could be building in those sorts of ideas. Particularly, there are a fair amount of those short stories that are perhaps showing women in a more subservient position, and I can imagine, knowing my students, that they will not be very happy about that. So that they can look at those things and they can manipulate patterns and conventions and genres and ideas, as well as the base text. They can look at moving it, transforming it, all those sorts of things. that it isn't just a random thing. And then we can talk to them about themes and ideas. Because they are poems and short stories, it's going to be quick again, but quick but in depth. There's lots of depth, lots of detail in all of those. There is perhaps also some ways that we can bring in the stories of Eva Luna. There's definitely some connections that you can draw between short stories of Amy Whitting and Eva Luna, and the stories of Eva Luna is a different cultural context as well, again, not just in the past, but obviously in a different setting. So in terms of why a different focus, I talked about those, shaping young people, adding cultural capital, literary expansion. You also have to fit 6 texts in somehow. And also, if you're thinking about Unit 3, I don't know about you, but after 6 months of post-colonial identity, the mood in the room might be a little bit different than what it started off with. And also, you don't want to bore them to death. And you do want to show them there is a world of literature. So what can you do? What can you build in? How can you start to think about, are there connections here that I can draw to make it the best possible for you and your students? So all of those ones that are there are sort of from the prescribed text list. They're all those sort of different ideas. But that's just why a different focus between IA1 and IA2. And that you can do it. You don't have to. If you can find a really great way in from something from a different identity in the first one to a very connected identity in the second one that's slightly different. And as you had a conversation before, hopefully you saw that there are several texts on there that do all have links across them. So use that. But this is just where I'm going to go with it. And that's why it's very, very brief for that one, because it is a little bit more me. In my context, this is what I'm doing. But it might start to spark some ideas for you and what you can do there. A note then on an IA2, and it was great that we had that stuff before. You could do a monologue if you want. But equally then you have to sit in the room and do it. Potentially with this whole new system of we don't know when these assessments are going to fit in, we don't know what stuff's going to happen, depending on your school's context, they might do it all in like an exam block, or it might not be, it might be in class, you have to shove them all in, and in terms of fairness, getting everyone at the same time, etc. But also because it's new and you want it to be interesting, and it's an interesting subject. I say that with all of my selfishness sitting behind it because I was on that writing team. But do something else with it if you can. It doesn't have to be high production values, because what it's looking for on the syllabus is that you are looking at the different cultural identity, different cultural context, or that you're manipulating different genre features. So it doesn't have to be, filmed with 10 million, HD sort of things. It doesn't have to be beautiful. It might be helpful if it is, but what does your syllabus actually ask you for? It's not asking you for it to be the most amazing thing. It's asking for you to make sure that they are doing what the ISMGs ask for. So that's straight out of the syllabus. Underneath the IAs, so IA 1, 2 and 3 I want to say, it gives you those suggestions. So you've got different suggestions there that you could use. The YouTube vlog, again, I can assure you that about 99% of your students would have seen a YouTube vlog at some point in their life. So can they do something like that? Can they build in sort of a mini movie? Again, it doesn't have to be beautiful. It could literally be different pictures cut together depending on what you're wanting to do with some voice over the top. Because it is spoken multimodal, like we heard in session 1, there does need to be a spoken element to it. But there are about 6 billion apps on the internet, and a fair amount of them free that will let you do that. If your students have a Mac, which all of them try to insist to have, or anything like that, a lot of them have something that you can just put voiceover over the top very, very easily. So it doesn't have to be amazing, but it does have to get the job done. It would be lovely if it was amazing. And then perhaps, they can publish it or something amazing like that, because we want them to be little authors and little directors. So can they do something with that? There are other things that you can do. You can do a combination. You can do all sorts of different things, all sorts of different ideas through there. With the, there it is. So with my class of Year 10s at the moment, like I said, we're doing the intertextuality, the detective fiction. What they are going to do is they're going to take some of the ideas from And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie and create a detective fiction style mini movie, episode, clip, etc. Fortunately, there are lots and lots of examples of this on the internet, and I've also cut them together one. That is basically just a detective talking through the case. And they have filmed, they've taken stuff, basically old office supplies, like those hanging files that are all rusty and disgusting, opened them up, written some notes while they're filming it, and they're telling the story. They're using the genre features. So it's dark because I get them to film, I turn all the lights off, it's a dark room. Okay, it's a closed setting because they're basically just showing a couple images. It's not, the production values might not be amazing, but they are doing all of those things. They're doing it purposefully. We've talked about it in class. I've shown them how to do it. And you've got to remember as well, all of that sits behind. I know there's an assessment piece at the end, but you're a teacher in a classroom and you talk them through and you set up their learning experiences. In terms of an overall overall year, this is what we're doing in Year 10. I do have copies of this that you're more than welcome to take because sharing is caring. This is just how we've set it up. I've made this decision because we're doing it in Year 10 as a taster. I was like, please stay with us until Year 11 and 12 and tell all your friends, come join us. That we go Unit 1, 2, 3, 4 at a Year 10 level. That's a school-based decision, depends on what your school wants to do. It was also a me-based decision of I really don't want to have to do Year 11 twice. So IA1 and IA2, because by the time they get to the end of Year 11, they might think this is the most boring subject in the history of Earth, so I'm leaving, which I don't want. I would like more students in my subject. So we're just doing it this way. It's giving them a taster of each of the assessment pieces in order, so analytical, imaginative, spoken, imaginative, written, and then analytical. That's just our decision, just what we're doing, but that is the way that it appears in 11 and 12. That will be their year, so it's a full taster. So do it in the same order. Just a thought. Just prepping as well. This then is the task that we've done. Yes, I know Fahrenheit 451 is on the English list, but I bagged it before the English list came out. So we've done that, but because I bagged it, we're not doing it in English in any other year level, so they don't get, 2 bites. It's just one in literature. Very simple question. That's a stylistic choice, just our choice, okay, that we're going with that. But equally, sitting behind that, then I know I don't have on there that they have to talk about criticisms, but we've given them criticisms, and surprise, surprise, they've used them. So we've given Year 10s explanations of how Fahrenheit 451 has references to Plato's allegory of Plato's cave. We've given them references to how it uses the motif of mirrors throughout. They've used it to support their analysis. They've taken those ideas and said, here's some evidence that does prove it, but also, nope. And here's my interpretation of it. So building in those skills, and you do that in Unit 1 in Year 11 if you're starting there. So you can build those things in very easily. This is just, our style, our structure. There'll be no pictures on yours, because in Year 11 and 12, if you've engaged with those online courses, no pictures on your assessment, sadly. But this is just what it looks like at a Year 10 level. My last comment then is, and in the spirit of sharing is caring, I stole this slide from the two who were presenting this morning in English, because I thought, why bother reinventing it? I want to say the same sort of thing. It's a new system, it's a new moment, it's a new world. So with this subject, to make the most of it, it doesn't have to be scary. You can share these ideas. You know what you're doing as an English teacher with that experience sitting behind you. How do you just now translate it? And that's sort of the main thing as well. Translate it across, translate it back. Make sure when you're looking at your syllabus that you're thinking, how can you use this? How can you connect ideas? How does your planning go from the end all the way back to the start, and then you check all the way back through? How are you building stuff together? We all know, as adults, as English teachers, that literature is consistently joined. There are things that you find in one text that appears in another text. So show that to your students as well. Think about how you can use this, how you can make this a great subject that you want to teach, that kids are excited to actually do, because there's plenty of opportunity to do that, and plenty of opportunity for you to just be building in those ideas. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Megan. I don't know about you guys, I have so much to think about, and I feel really privileged to be exposed to your thinking process about how you guys are preparing both this year for it and for next year. I hope you guys got as much out of it as I did, and this is just for you because we appreciate it, and thank you very much. So please help me thank Parry.